Welcome back. Today we're looking at Chapter 16, Section 5, A Nation Divides. As you can see, I've already done an audio recording for this, but I feel like to really capture this lesson, it's good to do it as a full Camtasia video recording. So this lesson is our final lesson in Chapter 16, and it coincides with pages 478 to 481 in your textbook. And our essential question for today is, how did the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 lead to a divided United States? That was kind of the last straw before everything went awry in the country. So we're specifically going to be looking at the election of Abraham Lincoln and the things that happened in the country directly after. Our key terms for today are unamendable, which basically just means unable to change, Lecompton Constitution, the Confederate States of America, secede, which we've talked about before, which means to withdraw from membership in a group, and specifically we're talking about the Confederate States of America seceding from the United States, and a garrison. So those are what we'll talk about, but first I want us to watch this video because it'll give an overview of the election of Abraham Lincoln and how that affected the United States.
Out of the four candidates that ran for president in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois won the most votes. About a month after the election, fearing that Lincoln would bring about an end to slavery, South Carolina seceded, that is, broke away from the United States. At that time, President Buchanan was still in charge of the country, due to the fact that Lincoln's inauguration was still 10 weeks away. Buchanan didn't want to send troops to South Carolina, and decided to wait to see what would happen next. In the meantime, another new state, Kansas, was admitted to the Union. Buchanan's decision not to use force in South Carolina proved to be a big mistake, because before Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, 6 other slave states, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, had seceded from the Union as well. They called themselves the Confederate States of America, and by the end of the year, the Confederates would be joined by North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia as well. A few days after South Carolina broke away from the Union, a small garrison of U.S. Army troops left Fort Moultrie, just outside of Charleston, and moved to Fort Sumter, a short distance away across the harbor. When South Carolina officials demanded that the U.S. troops leave Fort Sumter, they refused. In response, on April 12, 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on Fort Sumter as the citizens of Charleston watched on in horrified disbelief. And so began a 4-year civil war that would bring about the deaths of 620,000 American soldiers.
And we're back. So let's talk about the election of 1860. Pictured here is the 1860 election flag from the Republican Party. And if you turn your head sideways, you can see for president, Abraham Lincoln; for vice president, Hannibal Hamlin. Now, by 1860, the Democratic Party was just in complete disarray. They were all over the place when they met in Charleston, South Carolina, to try and choose their presidential candidate. Southern Democrats insisted that the nominating convention make a strong statement supporting slavery in the territories, while Western Democrats opposed that stance and argued for supporting popular sovereignty. And it was the latter position is the one that won out. So that caused a lot of the Southern delegates to walk out of the nominating convention. So Northern Democrats met later in Baltimore, Maryland, and nominated Stephen A. Douglas. And following all of the violence in Bleeding, Kansas, Douglas had lost a lot of his support within the party. However, he had reclaimed his prominence or his stature by denouncing President Buchanan and leading the Lecompton Constitution in 1858. Now, what was the Lecompton Constitution? Well, it was one of the constitutions. It was actually the second of 4 constitutions that was proposed for the state of Kansas, and the Lecompton Constitution focused on supporting slavery, the rights of slaveholders, and would allow more slaves to be brought into that territory. And President Buchanan had supported the Lecompton Constitution before Congress, which gave him the support of Southern Democrats, but many Northern Democrats saw this as a slap in the face, so they decided to side with the Republicans. So you have Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and Western Democrats all kind of fighting each other, as we see in this picture. Like each one was trying to tear off a piece of the United States and get a hold on that section. So the Southern Democrats reconvened in Richmond, Virginia, and nominated this man, John C. Breckinridge. And Breckinridge pledged to protect slavery in the territories. There was another party at this time called the Constitutional Union Party, which nominated John Bell. And this party, the Constitutional Union Party, was composed of mostly of former Whigs, and they had a little bit of strength in the border states, but they really lacked any semblance of vigor, or they didn't have a very strong hold in any other area other than those border states, and they ended up being dubbed the Old Gentleman's Party. So from their nickname, I think you can tell who the Constitutional Union Party appealed to.
Up to this point, Lincoln had no desire to be president, but he did want to be elected to the United States Senate. He planned to run for the Senate again in 1862. But in 1860, at the Illinois Republican Convention, Lincoln's name was placed in nomination to be a presidential candidate. The Republican National Convention met in Chicago on May 16, 1860. The most prominent candidate for the nomination was William H. Seward of New York. He had had a long political career, and it seemed a foregone conclusion that he would be nominated. The next most prominent name was Lincoln's. As a favorite son, he had the votes of the whole Illinois delegation. He began to be seen as Seward's rival. There was a great deal of political maneuvering among the delegates, and Lincoln was nominated on the 3rd ballot. Hannibal Hamlin, a senator from Maine, was nominated for vice president. In June, the Democrats met in Baltimore and nominated Stephen Douglas for president and Herschel Johnson, a Georgia Unionist, for vice president. Both parties campaigned vigorously, and on November 6th, the voters went to the polls.
Which brings us to the Republican Party for 1860 election. Now, William H. Seward was pretty confident that he was going to be the Republican nominee in 1860, but the party leaders realized that they had to become more than just the focal point for the anti-slavery movement. So included in the Republican platform were calls for a moderately higher tariff, federally sponsored internal improvements, and a homestead bill and a federal assistance for a transcontinental railroad to be built over a central route, which would appeal to the North and the South. And on slavery, the Republicans proclaimed that their stance was that each state could decide the issue within its own borders, and that no one could legalize slavery in the territories, neither Congress nor territorial legislatures. It had to be, so the official Republican stance was that each state had to decide within its own borders. So Seward was confident that because of this, he was going to get the presidential nomination. Now, On the other side, we have Mr. Abraham Lincoln, who we've talked about a few times, but he was a very respected state politician from Illinois. He was actually very attractive to the Republican delegates because he was a very talented speaker. He had kind of a moderate position on slavery, and he was from the West, so being the fact that he was a Westerner meant that he could challenge Stephen Douglas. And so in the nominating convention, Seward led on the first few ballots, but Lincoln kind of hung in there in contention. So on the third ballot, Lincoln prevailed, and his victory was due mostly to skillful maneuverings of his campaign managers. So they lined up the necessary votes with promises of patronage. Remember, think of the spoil system. It's similar to that. They said, all right, if you vote to nominate Lincoln, if he becomes president, we'll give you X number of jobs. So they were able to line up the votes, and then they just jammed the convention with people who supported Lincoln. So even though Seward was confident that he was going to get the nomination, it ended up going to Mr. Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. So during the campaign, Lincoln went through the South, and whenever he was speaking in the South, he preached the value of the Union. Notice that his main point was the value of the Union, not the evils of slavery. This was brilliant on his part because he was trying to appeal to his audience, saying that kind of staying quiet on the issue of slavery, and preaching the value of the Union. But almost in the same breath, he warned against secession and pledged that he would, if necessary, act with the conviction of Andrew Jackson in the nullification crisis almost 30 years earlier. And if you remember when we talked about the nullification crisis, that was when South Carolina had passed the Nullification Act, saying that they had the states had the right to nullify any law that they deemed to be unconstitutional, and Jackson threatened that he would bring the military in if necessary. So Lincoln, as he goes through the South, is trying to preach the value of staying together and staying as a unified country. But in the same breath, he said, if you do try to secede, I will take all necessary actions, and I will do everything in my power to keep the Union together. And as we see in this chart, Lincoln's strength, he was really confined to the North. But fortunate for him, though, the northern states were much more populous. They had a lot more people that were able to vote than in the South, and he won even though he only had 40% of the total popular vote, he won a decisive victory in the Electoral College, 59%. And Douglas, as we can see, won a pretty impressive amount of the popular vote, 29% to Lincoln's 40%, but only got 4% of the electoral vote. And as we know, the electoral vote is the one that decides who wins and who loses an election.
The impression produced by the size of his extremities and by his flapping and wide projecting ears may be removed by the appearance of kindliness, sagacity. The nose itself, a prominent organ, stands out from the face with an inquiring, anxious air, as though it was sniffing for some good thing in the wind. The eyes, dark, full, and deeply set, are penetrating, but full of an expression which almost amounts to tenderness. William Russell, London Times.
2 days after Jefferson Davis left home, Abraham Lincoln set out from Springfield, Illinois, for his capital.
Here I have lived a quarter of a century and passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with the task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell.
En route to Washington, the president's train stopped at Cleveland, Buffalo, Albany, and New York. In Philadelphia, warned of plots to kill him, Lincoln declared he would rather be assassinated than see a single star removed from the American flag. 2 days later, he reluctantly canceled plans for a grand arrival in Washington and slipped into the Capitol by train at dawn, wrapped in a shawl and protected by 2 armed guards. Inauguration Day in Washington was cloudy and cold. A large, tense crowd gathered beneath the unfinished dome. Cannon guarded the Capitol grounds. Sharpshooters lined the roof. Lincoln promised not to interfere with slavery, but he denied the right of any state to secede, vowed to defend federal installations, and spoke directly to the South.
In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.
The South reacts. Now, in the South, there was a great unhappiness, I'll say, about Lincoln's election. And that, I would say even the term great unhappiness was a huge understatement. Many Southerners thought that with Lincoln being elected, they no longer had a voice in the national government. So as a last-ditch effort, Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky proposed an amendment to the Constitution that would make the Constitution itself unamendable or unable to be changed. So if the Constitution could never again be changed, then slaves would be legal forever below the Missouri Compromise line and the Compromise of 1850. So this bill, I mean, we now know it was never passed. The bill received very little support because the issue was no longer over slavery in the West. It was that Southerners really felt betrayed. They felt that the North had put an abolitionist in the White House and thought that their only choice to maintain their way of life was to leave the Union. And starting with South Carolina in 1860, six states followed South Carolina and decided to leave the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy, and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. And so the first states to secede were South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. And we can also see from this map that there were other states that did secede, but we'll talk about that in a moment.
November 19th, 1860. A most gloomy day in Wall Street. Everything at a deadlock. First-class paper not negotiable. Stocks falling. George Templeton Strong.
In New York, emotions were no less explosive, and George Templeton Strong, a conservative lawyer who distrusted Lincoln, began to keep track of events in his diary.
The bird of our country is a debilitated chicken disguised in eagle feathers. We have never been a nation. We are only an aggregate of communities, ready to fall apart at the first serious shock.
When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, there were 33 states in the Union, and a 34th, free Kansas, was about to join. By the time of his inauguration, 5 months later, just 27 states would remain. The suddenness of secession took everyone by surprise. South Carolina led the way on December 20th. A bell in Charleston tolled the succession of departing states. Mississippi on January 9th. Florida on the 10th. Then Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. In Texas, Governor Sam Houston was deposed when he tried to stop his state from joining the Confederacy.
Let me tell you what is coming. After the sacrifice of countless millions of treasure and hundreds of thousands of lives, you may win Southern independence. But I doubt it. The North is determined to preserve this Union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people as you are, for they live in colder climates. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the steady momentum and perseverance of a mighty avalanche.
Texas left anyway. Even Virginia, the most populous southern state, birthplace of 7 presidents, seemed sure to follow.
All the indications are that this treasonable inflammation, secessionitis, keeps on making steady progress, week by week. If disunion becomes an established fact, we have one consolation. The self-amputated members were diseased beyond immediate cure, and their virus will infect our system no longer. George Templeton Strong.
The Charleston Mercury. The tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated.
Pictured here is a very interesting man in American history. I know I mentioned that the Confederacy elected Jefferson Davis, but who was Jefferson Davis? Who was this guy? Well, his life story is actually there's a mirror. It's similar, but also very different to that of President Lincoln. Davis had been born in Kentucky, not far from Lincoln in time or in distance. But unlike Lincoln, he was a decorated war veteran and politician. He graduated from West Point in 1828 and married the daughter of Zachary Taylor in 1835. Now, unfortunately, she died shortly after they were married, and in 1845 he married Verena Howell, the daughter of a Mississippi aristocrat and plantation owner. So his first wife was the daughter of the eventual president Zachary Taylor, and his second wife was the daughter of a very well-to-do plantation owner in Mississippi. And he successfully ran for the House of Representatives only to resign in 1846 to join his former father-in-law in Texas, preparing for the Mexican-American War. And Davis led a regiment from Mississippi and held his position in Buena Vista thanks to some expert artillery work by a young captain named Braxton Bragg, which saved Zachary Taylor, again his former father-in-law, from defeat. So Davis he had been elected to the House of Representatives, but left shortly after to become a war hero in the Mexican-American War, and to lead a regiment under his former father-in-law and save his former father-in-law from defeat. And following this, he became a spokesman for the South, and viewed it as kind of a country within a country. And when the Confederacy seceded, Davis was actually not the first choice to become their president. there were a few men, Alexander Stephens and George Howell Cobb, that were first considered, but Stephens had kind of a pro-union stand before secession, so that made a lot of people lose interest in him. And Howell Cobb was also considered for the job, but Cobb refused. So Davis became a compromise candidate who was chosen in secrecy and eventually approved by popular vote on February 22nd, 1862.
Thank God we have a country at last to live for, to pray for, and, if need be, to die for. Lucius Quintus Lamar.
On February 18th, a few minutes after noon, Jefferson Davis stood on the steps of the Alabama State House at Montgomery and took the oath of office as President of the Provisional Confederate States of America. The crowds cheered, wept, sang "Farewell to the Star-Spangled Banner" and "Dixie," a minstrel tune written by a Northerner. He was brittle, nervous, often unable to sleep, and partly blind in one eye. Accustomed to being obeyed, he scorned the bargaining that made democratic government work. Sam Houston said he was as cold as a lizard and ambitious as Lucifer. Like Lincoln, he was a Kentuckian, the son of an itinerant farmer. But he had been educated at West Point, fought in Mexico, and served as Secretary of War. As senator from Mississippi, he resisted secession as long as he could. But when his state withdrew from the Union, he headed home to his plantation Briarfield, south of Vicksburg. He and his wife Verena were there, clipping roses in the garden, when word came that he had been elected president.
Reading that telegram, he looked so grieved that I feared some evil had befallen our family. After a few minutes, he told me, as a man might speak of a sentence of death.
Upon my head were showered smiles, plaudits, and flowers. But beyond them I saw troubles innumerable. Jefferson Davis.
The Confederate Constitution was almost identical to the United States Constitution, but it gave the president a line-item veto, a 6-year term, and it outlawed international slave trading. The Confederate cabinet met for the first time in a hotel room. A sheet of stationery pinned to the door marked the president's office. "Where will I find the State Department?" a visitor asked Robert Toombs, Secretary of State. "In my hat, sir, and the archives in my coat pocket."
Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. Vice President Alexander Stephens.
God forgive us, but ours is a monstrous system. Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resemble the white children. All the time they seem to think themselves patterns, models of husbands and fathers. Mary Chestnut.
Mary Chestnut and her husband James, a former United States Senator from South Carolina, moved among the highest circles of the Confederacy and were close to Jefferson Davis and his wife. Mary was subject to depressions and nightmares, for which she sometimes took opium. Now she too began to keep a diary.
This journal is intended to be entirely objective. My subjective days are over.
Which brings us to what we've been building to this whole marking period. The Civil War begins. Now, on March 5th, 1861, the day after his inauguration as President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln received a message from Major Robert Anderson, who was commander of the U.S. troops holding Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Remember, South Carolina had seceded already at this point, So between the election of Lincoln and when he took the oath of office, South Carolina and the 6 other states had seceded. So the day after he was inaugurated, Lincoln received this message from Major Anderson, and the message stated that there was less than a 6-week supply of food left in the fort. And like I mentioned, even though this was his first day as president, these other 7 states had already seceded, and tensions were really reaching a boiling point between the United States and the Confederacy. And there had been attempts made by the Confederate government to settle the differences between the Union, but those were spurned by Lincoln because Lincoln did not recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate government. Lincoln didn't believe that the Southern states had the right to secede, but he did want to avoid war. But on the other hand, the Confederacy felt it could no longer tolerate the presence of a, quote, foreign force in its territory, this foreign force being the Union troops. And they really felt that they and Lincoln felt that a conflict was inevitable. Like, eventually something was going to happen to spark a conflict. So Lincoln devised a plan that would cause the Confederates to fire the first shot, and thus, as he hoped, inspire the states that had not yet seceded to unite in the efforts to restore the Union. I mean, if we pull that map back up, at this point it was only these bottom 7 states. There were still the border states in the middle that were at this point still a part of the Union, and Lincoln hoped that by causing the Confederacy to fire the first shot, it would inspire those border states to stay with the Union. As we can see, of the 8 states that were on the border, 4 of them stayed with the Union, 4 of them joined the Confederacy. So on April 8th, 1861, Lincoln notified Governor Francis Pickens of South Carolina that he was going to attempt to resupply the Union Fort Sumter in Charleston, which, as we can see from this map, is right in the middle of Charleston Harbor. The Confederate commander at Charleston, General P.G.T. Beauregard, and I'm just going to say this, I can't say that name without saying it with a Southern accent. It's impossible. P.G.T. Beauregard was ordered by the Confederate government to demand the evacuation of the fort, and if they refused, to force its evacuation. So on April 11th, General Beauregard delivered his ultimatum to General Anderson, who replied, "Gentlemen, if you do not batter the forces to pieces about us, we shall be starved out in a few days." And on direction from the Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama, Beauregard notified Anderson that if he would state the time of his evacuation, the Southern forces would hold their fire. So basically, he said, Beauregard gave the ultimatum to the Union commander, saying, "You need to get out of here." Anderson replied, "We're going to be starved out in a few days anyways." So Beauregard took that in, replied, and said, "Okay, if you state the time that you're going to leave, we're not going to fire on you. We'll go about this as gentlemen." And Anderson replied that he would evacuate by noon of the 15th, so by noon 4 days later, unless he received other instructions or additional supplies from the Union. And he knew that the supply ships were expected to be there before that time. So Anderson said, "We'll leave by the 15th," knowing full well that he was going to be resupplied before that. Anderson was told that his answer was unacceptable and that Beauregard would open fire in 1 hour. So as he shook the hands of the messengers, he said, "If we do not meet again in this world, I hope we may meet in the better one." And at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, 1861, 43 Confederate guns in a ring around Fort Sumter began the bombardment that initiated the bloodiest war in American history. And at about 7 a.m., Captain Abner Doubleday, the fort's second in command, was given the honor of firing the first shot in defense of the fort, and the firing continued all day, with Union forces firing slowly to try and conserve ammunition. And at night, the fire from the fort stopped, but the Confederates still lobbed the occasional shell into the fort, just to remind them that they're still there. And although they had been confined inside Fort Sumter for more than 3 months with few supplies and poorly nourished, the men of the Union garrison vigorously defended their post from the Confederate bombardment that began on the morning of April 12th. Several times cannonballs had lodged into the fort's wooden barracks and started fires, but each time the Union soldiers, with a little help from an evening rainstorm, had extinguished the flames. The Union garrison managed to return fire all day long, but because of a shortage of cloth, gunpowder, cartridges, they used just 6 of their cannons and fired very slowly. The men got little sleep that night as the Confederate fire continued, and guards kept a sharp lookout for a Confederate attack or for relief boats. Union supply ships just outside the harbor had been spotted by the garrison, and the men were disappointed that the ships made no attempt to come to their relief. After another breakfast of rice and salt pork on the morning of April 13th, the exhausted Union garrison again began returning cannon fire, but only 1 round every 10 minutes. Soon the barracks again caught fire from a rebel hotshot, and despite the men's efforts to douse the flames, by 10 a.m. the barracks were burning out of control. Shortly after that, every wooden structure in the fort was ablaze, and a magazine containing 300 pounds of gunpowder was in danger of exploding. The Confederate gunners saw the smoke and were well aware of the wild uproar they were causing inside the island fort. They openly showed their admiration of the bravery of the Union garrison by cheering and applauding when, after a prolonged stillness, the garrison sent a solid shot screaming in their direction. So they actually cheered and applauded when the Union forces fired back after a prolonged stillness, which proved to them that they were still there and they were still fighting. The fort's large flagstaff had been hit by fire from the surrounding Confederate batteries, and the colors fell to the ground. Lieutenant Norman J. Hall braved the enemy fire to race across the grounds and retrieve the flag. Then he and 2 others found a substitute flagpole and raised the Stars and Stripes once more above the fort. Once the flag came down, General P.G.T. Beauregard, who commanded the Confederate forces, sent 3 of his aides to offer the fort's commander, Major Robert Anderson, assistance in extinguishing the fires. Before they arrived, they saw the Union flag rise again, but it was then shortly after replaced with a white flag signaling surrender. Arriving at the fort, Beauregard's aides were informed that the garrison had just surrendered to Louis T. Wigfall, a former U.S. Senator from Texas. The terms were soon worked out, and Fort Sumter, after having braved 33 hours of bombardment, its food and ammunition nearly exhausted, fell on April 13, 1861, to the crushing firepower of the rebels. Miraculously, no one on either side had been killed or seriously wounded. The generous terms of surrender allowed Anderson to run up his flag for a 100-gun salute before he and his men evacuated the fort the next day. The salute began at 2 p.m. on April 14th, but was cut short to 50 guns after an accidental explosion killed one of the gunners and mortally wounded another. So nobody was killed in the actual battle, but the only casualties were from an accident during the 100-gun salute. Carrying their tattered flag, the men marched out of the fort and boarded a boat that took them to the Union ships outside the harbor. And upon their return to the north, they were greeted as heroes. And as you can see, this is a picture of Fort Sumter now flying the Confederate flag.
I do not pretend to go to sleep. How can I? If Anderson does not accept terms at 4, The orders are he shall be fired upon. I count 4 St. Michael chimes. I begin to hope. The heavy booming of a cannon, I sprang out of bed, and on my knees prostrate, I prayed as I have never prayed before.
The Civil War began at 4:30 a.m. on the 12th of April, 1861. General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard ordered his Confederate gunners to open fire on Fort Sumter, at that hour only a dark shape out in Charleston Harbor. Confederate Commander Beauregard was a gunner, so skilled as an artillery student at West Point that his instructor kept him on as an assistant for another year. That instructor was Major Robert Anderson, Union commander inside Fort Sumter.
All the pent-up hatred of the past months and years is voiced in the thunder of these cannon, and the people seem almost beside themselves in the exaltation of a freedom they deem already won.
The signal to fire the first shot was given by a civilian, Edmund Ruffin, a Virginia farmer and editor, who had preached secession for 20 years. Of course, he said, I was delighted to perform the service. "34 hours later, a white flag over the fort ended the bombardment. The only casualty had been a Confederate horse. It was a bloodless opening to the bloodiest war in American history.
The first gun that was fired at Fort Sumter sounded the death knell of slavery. They who fired it were the greatest practical abolitionists this nation has produced.
April 13th. So civil war is inaugurated at last. God defend the right.
April, Montgomery Daily Advertiser. The intelligence that Fort Sumter has surrendered to the Confederate forces yesterday sent a thrill of joy to the heart of every true friend of the South. The face of every Southern man was brighter, his step lighter, and his bearing prouder than it had been before.
In Boston, jubilant volunteers marched past Faneuil Hall, eager to avenge Fort Sumter. In Baltimore, anti-Lincoln men rampaged through the streets. In Richmond, a mob marched on the State House, tore down the Stars and Stripes, and raised the Stars and Bars. There was no longer any doubt that Virginia would secede. And in New York, 100,000 people crowded Union Square, where the Sumter flag now flew. Walt Whitman, sometime poet and journalist for the Brooklyn Standard, was stunned by the news. All the past we leave behind with Sumter, he said.
Woe to those who began this war if they were not in bitter earnest. Mary Chestnut.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. So, if Chapter 16 could be summed up in one phrase, I would sum it up as, was there any possible way to avoid the Civil War? between compromises, legislation, Supreme Court cases, it seemed like nobody could find a peaceful solution to the question, what do we do about slavery? The economy of the North had made slavery all but non-existent north of the Mason-Dixon line, but in the South, it was still a huge part of the culture and a huge part of the economy. So for today's discussion, I want you to answer the following question in your own words. Did the United States do everything possible to avoid a civil war, or was war inevitable? We discussed the various compromises that tried to allow slavery to continue, but stop its spread into new areas, as well as opinions that slavery would eventually die out over time. So, in your response to this question, I want you to include two things. First, you need to state your own opinion. Could war have been avoided, or was it inevitable? So choose one side, which you believe, like war could have been avoided or it was inevitable. And following that, I want you to support your opinion with at least two relevant facts or examples from the text. So it's one thing to have an opinion, it's another to be able to support that with necessary information. Now, once you have posted your answer to the question, I want you to go back and look at the posts made by at least two other classmates. And since we are all responsible students of our wonderful American nation, I shouldn't have to remind you to be respectful in your posts and your responses to your fellow classmates. So please, be respectful. And when you respond to your classmates, I want you to respectfully discuss why you agree or disagree with the points that they made. Or if, say, you disagree with their point, but you feel that they made a good logical argument, say, I don't agree with your point, but you didn't, but this is a compelling argument. So you'll given 10 points for your initial post and 2 points for each of your 2 replies. And be sure to keep an eye out for Hootenanny Hubner.